So in the UK, government basically has to respect human rights law and human rights protections. Even if your case is found to not have good grounding, legally it can't evict you, right? It can't knowingly make someone destitute. It can't say, we know that you are someone who does not have papers to work in this country, and we've been providing you with a place to live up until now, but we're not going to do that anymore, and we can't deport you because it's not safe to deport you, so we're just going to leave you on the street. So there's quite, it's a law to prevent that from happening, right? So, which is in some ways good, maybe not enough, but it's good, it prevents that from happening. However, the British government started outsourcing responsibility for housing to private companies. So it took it out of the hands of local authorities and gave it to Serco. And Serco started forcibly evicting people by just changing the locks when they were out of the house. And this was in Scotland. They got taken to court, and the judge ruled that, yeah, actually, the government can't do that, but Serco can.
Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party.
Hello, friend, and welcome to Mandatory Redistribution Party. I'm Jack Evans, and in this episode, I talk to anthropologist, journalist, and activist Siobhán McGuirk about the new book she's co-edited with Adrian Pine and tons of other writers called Asylum for Sale: Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry. Thank you for listening to Mandos. Thanks especially to those of you who share episodes on social media and give us nice reviews on iTunes or subscribe to our Patreon. We really do appreciate it. The focus of this conversation with Siobhán is mainly on the role of private companies in asylum systems, especially in the UK, but we talk about a lot. Like Siobhán's super smart and knowledgeable and very humble. But we start off by getting into what asylum is and its place in British public consciousness. Check it out.
And there's this idea of people making false claims. They use this language of the bogus asylum seeker, which is really kind of a ridiculous concept, because the whole idea of asylum is that it's a right shared by everyone on the planet. It's a universal right that should you be suffering from persecution, or in fact, the language of the UN documents around asylum, the international law foundation of asylum is that if you have a well-founded fear of persecution, now that could be because of your political opinion, because of your religion, because of your nationality, your ethnicity, your belonging to a category like gay people, then you have a human right, a basic human right, fundamental right to leave the place that you are and go elsewhere to seek safety. Maybe the most famous asylum seeker of recent years has been Edward Snowden. Who left the US and went to Russia. And that was a kind of really unusual experience, because we're more used to thinking about asylum seekers as, let's say, going the other way. There is a lot of work being done that discusses legal obligation, moral obligation, talks about people in terms of deservingness. Are they really a deserving person? Are they really being persecuted? And those are all really important conversations, and that we think about the moral obligation that we have in the West to accept asylum seekers and refugees. But what we wanted to do with this book is say, well, what we're not talking about is the huge amounts of profit making that are going on around this process of people fleeing danger and trying to find safety elsewhere. And in the efforts to facilitate that happening, but also in the efforts to prevent that from happening, there are actors who are making a hell of a lot of money.
Like, people making money from this stuff is one of the things that just explodes the idea of history as progress. Like, if you dug up Churchill, like the most hardcore racist jacket potato that ever lived, and showed him modern restrictions on migrations, like just the laws, and then the money that's being made from those processes, it'd blow his hammy head. Like, I'm not saying he wouldn't get a buzz off it, but you'd be surprised. Like, Churchill's idea of a border would be quite different.
I think if we look back in history of borders, empire, concepts like migration and asylum, definitely we can see loads of paradoxes or hypocrisies. The imperial forces of Europe were very, very comfortable with the idea that borders did not apply to them. The idea of are we allowed to move to India and settle in India? I mean, that wasn't the question. It was just like, no, we're going to do that because we're the powerful, we have that right, and we're going to not only go there, but we're going to kind of take over, impose our power, extract resources, subjugate individuals. And if you go and extract people's resources, power being generated in a place and put it elsewhere, so take it out of Asia and put it into the West, out of Africa and into Europe, then how is it surprising in any way that people will follow? And at different times we have needed people to follow and wanted people. I say we as the British state. And so you think about the Windrush scandal of the last few years. Need to think about that in the context of colonial exploitation and then desperate need for workers. And so kind of, we'd like everyone to come over here, please, and work for us. We won't treat you as equal citizens. We won't give you kind of the formal citizenship. We'll give you these papers that we can probably just like throw away in 50 years' time, and then just say, well, you're from Jamaica, so have you got any right to be here anyway?
Joe Wilding's chapter in the book, the marketisation of asylum justice in the UK, is just such a shocking exploration of how the market can be so cruel to people. Like, I expected these law firms to be squeezing profit out of the system, but it's even more depressing that they actually seem to be trying to help people, but the market system means they can't do it properly because they haven't got enough money and time. And then the victim of this isn't, the lawyer. Then I'm obviously they're having a bad time, but the victim of this stuff is the asylum seekers, right? So even where there's laws to protect asylum seekers, you need a lawyer to make the defence, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complete race to the bottom. So they say, we'll give you X amount of money to work on a case. And we've figured that out because we think that it should take you 3 hours to work on that case. And actual lawyers are saying, well, no, if we want to do a good job, then that will take 10 hours. It's like saying, you've not got a month to build a house. You've got 1 day. Like, that house is obviously going to be a bit shit, and it's not the builder's fault, right? It's because they're working under these like huge constraints. And I think Jo in her chapter does a really good job of like highlighting that you can understand why so many asylum seekers, with very good reason, feel so frustrated with the legal aid that they have, and they feel, that my lawyer isn't very responsive, isn't doing enough for me. And in some cases there are unscrupulous lawyers who kind of will take the money and run, but actually in most cases people are being put in a position where they have to work overtime, risk extreme burnout, or if you find an extra hour to put on a case, it might mean that an hour comes away from a different case.
The increasing role of the market and private companies in the asylum system fits right in with how it's just increasingly brutal and repressive. But the people doing this stuff say it's about like efficiency and pragmatism. Like
you were saying earlier, we think that history is kind of this positive march to a better place. And actually, in the US, it used to be slightly better for asylum seekers, where they could apply for a work permit much sooner, and so at least would be able to be self-sustaining whilst they're awaiting a decision on their case. But the US government said, we think too many people are coming here, submitting a claim that they don't ever think will be successful, only in order to be able to get a work permit. So their so-called solution to that was to say, well, we should just stop people from being able to work much longer, because we'll make life so hard for people that it won't seem like an appealing option to get a work permit and then just kind of walk away from your case. And that kind of attitude is just all over the place now. It's completely pervasive. So what they call deterrent policies. So Priti Patel loves these. She's like, let's put...
We're being evil to be good.
Yeah, exactly. She's like that kind of comedy villain that, it hurts me more than it hurts you. And you're like, no, I'm pretty sure you're getting some pleasure from this, right?
We want to ensure that, quite frankly, our asylum system is not being abused by those, quite frankly, who are not genuine asylum seekers.
Well, she seriously considered the idea of putting giant wave machines in the English Channel, or these kind of measures that are purely designed by their own admission. They'll say, we need to let people know that they're not going to get an easy ride here, as if anyone fleeing mortal danger is A, meeting people on their way with a really robust understanding of the UK asylum system, and B, is going to be put off when the option behind them is death.
And the thing is the easiest solution is to make it safe to come, right? Mm-hmm. It's sitting right there. Yeah. Did you see the approval rating for that offshore detention centre in the Atlantic?
Yeah. Really alarming. Yeah.
It was really scary. But, we already have Yarl's Wood and stuff. But that logic of...
We need to have these really violent borders, because actually, even I feel bad about this, but I have to do it for your safety, because the more I discourage you from coming, I'm actually keeping you safe.
Never mind what you're going from.
Yeah.
Which probably we caused. Maybe we should get into why politicians in the press are so interested in contrasting asylum seekers and economic migrants.
The distinction between economic, this idea of an economic migrant and an asylum seeker is really, it's really important to kind of push back against, because being forced into poverty is often a consequence of persecution or of war, or of any number of things. It's a very kind of sort of irrelevant distinction, because it means that it creates this expectation that real asylum seekers are not also in economic need, which of course is absolutely the case. And also this idea that people who are coming for a better chance of life, I would like to be in the last lines of the book about a young Afghan man who wants to be a singer one day. And why should he not have dreams of stardom, the career that he wants, of gainful employment, of having a life worth living, an income worth living, at the same time as saying, I would also not like to live in a place where I'm under constant threat because of my political opinion and the war that's raging.
Borders sort of aren't borders depending on who you are. They're experienced totally differently, aren't they?
Right. Yeah.
Like you said, the experience of borders for the global working class is very different from the experience of the global super rich.
Absolutely, yeah.
Elon Musk's probably never really, he's never going to experience border violence, is he?
If you invest £500,000 in a UK business, my figure might be wrong. I don't know if it's changed, but if you invest, it's got the idea is that you've got to invest in a British industry. In the US, they have the same concept. They sometimes call it a job creating visa. So you become you're not an economic migrant, but you're a job creating migrant. So you say, I'm gonna build a hotel. That hotel is going to provide at least 10 jobs or 50 jobs or however many jobs it is.
And it's totally nuts, because you're probably going to open that hotel and then hire cheap migrant labour to do the hospitality work. And then extract profit from them, but because you're not extracting profit, you're a job creator,
right? Exactly. No one's asking what's the quality of that job? Are you going to be paying sick pay and holiday pay? That's not. It's this kind of nebulous idea of people with money create jobs, so we should give them all the helping hands.
And it's the double layer of exploitation, isn't it? We're exploiting people in the countries where they were born and decimating their economies, either just through economic extraction or with bombs sometimes. And then they come here and we exploit them here because we dehumanize them. We don't give them the same rights as other workers, but the economy depends on exploiting that cheap labour. So it's just lose wherever you are.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one chapter in the book features an organisation called Retain Voices, which is a UK-based organisation that really focuses on giving space to people who are held in detention. One of their statements on their website is from the hunger strikers at Yarlswood Detention Centre from a few years ago. They focused on exploitation within the detention centre as one of the reasons why they were on hunger strike. So a judge ruled that it was completely lawful for private detention companies to pay a nominal hourly rate of about £1 an hour to people for cleaning toilets and doing menial tasks around the detention centre. And the detention centre argued, it's to alleviate boredom. We shouldn't pay them because it's not a real job. But of course, they're saving the minimum wage that they would be obliged to pay someone who was not also held in detention. And so they're companies that are receiving money for the government in order to hold people in detention, many of whom have no good reason to be held there because they're released back into the community soon afterwards, because it's concluded that we can't deport you and actually you're not a flight risk, so sorry for just holding you for 6 months for no good reason. And then at the same time, cutting their own costs and increasing their profit margin by not having to pay staff to do certain jobs because they can just exploit the people inside to do these tasks. Yes, I mean £1 per hour. It's absolutely wild, but it's completely normalised.
Who's running Yarls? Is it Serco?
Serco, yeah.
Serco, yeah.
Serco.
It's just wild.
The CEO of Serco, Sir Nicholas Soames, and his brother was until this past election, was a Conservative MP. And you mentioned his grandfather earlier on. His grandfather was Winston Churchill, right? So these are people with... I think it's a very relevant conversation when we look at who's getting track and trace and coronavirus contracts, right? So Serco is also getting a bunch of them as well. But these are people who are very cosy with the Conservative Party in particular, but the UK government more broadly. And they're companies that are seeing an opportunity to make huge amounts of money through the process of demonising and restricting rights to people seeking asylum. And that could be in detention, but, cover all your bases. You can also get involved in asylum seeker housing. So Serco detains people, but it also has the contracts for providing people asylum seekers housing outside of detention. You have private security companies who are paid to, quote unquote, escort people onto deportation flights. You have airline companies that accept government money to deport people, to take people forcibly back to different countries. Virgin Airlines, British Airways. That's the kind of really industrial level part of it, because these are huge companies. These are companies that you can buy stocks in.
Yeah, your pension fund's probably invested in it. And that's all the above board legal vanilla profit making, which exists right alongside the illegal profit making as a consequence of the legal stuff, which is your people smugglers, etc.
People who are helping obtain visas, falsify bank statements to help you apply to get a visa, that kind of thing. People accepting money called smugglers sometimes. In the US-Mexico border, they're often called coyotes. So people who are paid to help people cross borders. There's a lot of organised crime involved in that, but there's also kind of smaller scale operations. There's exploitation that happens en route, huge sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, so people who are travelling in order to seek asylum somewhere overland because they haven't got the financial capital to get a plane ticket and a visa. So the most wealthy people can travel from city to city on an aeroplane, which is much safer than having to cross overland. But if you're kind of a working class person, then overland is your choice. And then you are vulnerable to massive labour exploitation, sexual exploitation, enslavement, imprisonment. And so there's mechanisms of profit making, let's say, kind of going on all over.
And that kind of criminal profit making, the architects of the legal profit making, they love to focus on them as like the baddies of the situation, right, when of course that criminal profit making is only possible because of the border violence that's legal.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
And again, it gets us back to that kind of that, we could call it a paradox or a hypocrisy or just a ludicrous claim. But the idea that, we must punish asylum seekers because a criminal gang helped them get here. Which, I mean, could you imagine saying, like, you're the victim of a crime and we want those criminals to stop committing that crime, so we're going to imprison you as the victim of that crime, right? Is that in any way going to prevent these unscrupulous, they're being characterized or constructed as these, unscrupulous organized criminals? Are they going to stop putting people on boats because that they know those people are going to end up in detention centres? I don't think so.
It's almost as if their priority isn't an effective policy, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's almost as if you're
I reckon
not
they're
quite being,
else.
Maybe being a bit disingenuous, right?
I mean, the wildest, you said you've done your research in the US, and I couldn't find a statistic for the UK, but I did find a statistic for the US in terms of how much money's involved here, right? So the US budget for border and immigration control in the last 25 years has gone up 133,567%.
Yeah. It's
Which is
mind-boggling.
It's completely insane.
Yeah. And the reason that we can't find those statistics in the UK context is because they are kind of so hidden. Partly because you can ask, like, what do we define? Like, the US is quite proud of its, like, rampant xenophobia in some ways. Whereas in the UK, it's
a
quite
national pastime.
Yeah, but it's quite hard to, like, parcel out. I mean, I get asked this a lot in reference to the book, like how much money are we talking about here? And in many ways, it's impossible to determine because how do you quantify all these different activities, right? So you start adding up border securitization, and then you start adding up detention centres, and then asylum seeker housing, and then the stipends that asylum seekers receive, and then your legal aid bill, and then how much if you wanted to add in NHS care or social worker care, like what proportion of those budgets could you say with any kind of confidence were being used by asylum seekers? People with anti-immigrant views often use that lack of information to make claims that don't really seem believable, like this idea that asylum seekers are putting a huge strain on the NHS. There's no proof for it at all. So it's, in some ways, people enjoy the fact that it's very difficult to quantify, but in the UK case, it's very difficult to quantify those things. And then you have this additional aspect of the UK has its own borders, but then it has European border securitization investments over the last, since however long we've been involved in the EU, but particularly we can say, for example, Frontex and the EU border security budget. We can look at how that's risen.
Fortress Europe.
Yeah, exactly. How the creation of Fortress Europe has increased, but it's very difficult to kind of quantify the actual amounts. And then you get these kind of other areas where they're attached to what we call the asylum industry, but they're maybe not immediately relevant. How? And so I'll give you an example of how foreign aid is tied to the asylum industry. So you have the Australian government wants to build detention centres in Papua New Guinea, so that it can do this policy of saying, if you come here to seek asylum, we will not give you the right to even stay on this land. We're going to put you elsewhere. In order to do that, you have to make a deal with Papua New Guinea, right? So what does that deal look like, and what does Papua New Guinea ask for in return? And so what we've seen is this kind of negotiation of, well, if you do this for us, then that will reflect well on our relationship. So maybe that will help us sort out a trade deal. Maybe that will help us bump up our foreign aid budget or development aid budget that's due to be recalculated to you next year. And we've seen this in the US with the request that Mexico house asylum seekers for processing, not in the US. So asylum seekers to the US are housed in Mexico for processing. And that was a very shocking story. But, there's a trade deal to be negotiated. So what's Mexico going to say?
They're not going to say no.
Another aspect of it is asylum seekers being created, let's say, or conditions in which people cannot live safe, fulfilling lives are created through capitalist expansion and war, whether that's war for oil or, if people ask, how is the UK going to get enough money to receive and care for these asylum seekers, we can just say, well, what was the value of the contract of selling arms to Yemen, or to Saudi Arabia? Sorry, the contract of selling arms to Saudi Arabia to then use against Yemen. So
wow,
so we can connect those dots.
Like one Tomahawk missile costs £1 million. It's like how many of them were dropped on Libya? And obviously you don't need a bomb to ruin someone's home. You can just destroy the planet's climate, right? Then demand they stay in the place that you've made unlivable.
We're seeing the kind of worst effects of climate change in terms of displacement of people happening in the global south. But we know that carbon emissions are really coming much more heavily from the global north. So who's paying for our love of oil in the global north? It's people who are suffering from flooding and drought and extreme hurricanes and weather conditions. But we're saying there's no space for you, right? That's the price. You're paying the price for our activity, and we've got no scope to support you.
Wow, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, even you're at like galaxy brain level, but even my little tiny brain is looking at like the language about money around these issues. No one ever goes, oh, how much does Yarl's Wood cost? How much would it cost to build, like, say, Patel's giant wave machines? There's an infinite well of money for the border violence, but then when it's like, ooh, this asylum seeker's costing this much to the NHS, or and then suddenly the money's it's gone.
And it's much. I think a very, very basic response to that is much, much, much cheaper for someone to live in a house and have a weekly stipend to be able to buy their own food and look after themselves, buy the beauty products they want, buy whatever. It's a small amount of money that people get, but it's so much cheaper for that to happen and for someone to have a local GP and all those kind of things than to hold someone in a prison and have all, in a prison you have to have a staff to do the cooking, you have to have a food budget, you have to have people coming in to provide healthcare, or you have to provide transportation for people to go to the doctors. And it's just so much more expensive to hold people in these immigration prisons. But I think, like you say, suddenly the cost argument disappears when people are offered a more punitive measure. So you mentioned earlier the YouGov poll about how do you feel about the idea of offshore detention. It was over 50% of Conservative voters, I think it was 54% of Conservative voters, said, yeah, sounds great. And you're like, well, that's going to be very expensive. So why are you suddenly not... What about that small state you wanted?
Yeah. But there was that Labour lord as well, some admiral, who was like, perhaps the solution to these asylum seekers is we could perhaps concentrate them in some sort of camp. And then everyone was like, whoa. That was only like a month ago. It was like at the start of October. I was like, mate, you talking about concentration camps there, buddy?
Now I've heard it out loud.
I think he used to work in Blair's Home Office or something.
Yeah. I remember...
They were the guys that built Yarl's Wood, weren't they? So.
I was going to say, we mentioned pre-Trump before, but I remember back in my youth occupying Phil Wallace's Oldham constituency office when he was immigration minister in the Labour government. So it's certainly not a party political move.
No.
Bill Clinton... you're talking about the investments in so-called border securitization in the US. Bill Clinton was a huge advocate and proponent of that. And actually a lot of the They were called fences, not walls, but, bigger
Cheaper.
and better for Donald Trump. But these border fences basically didn't really stop the numbers of people trying to cross the border into America, but it made the routes that were available much less safe. So it meant that more people died in the desert and therefore weren't counted as having crossed, right? So, you invest in closing pathways that basically force people to painful death.
Jesus.
So very bleak.
And then, of course, Fence Corp make their money.
Yeah.
And that'll be labelled as pragmatic and necessary. Like, tell someone who's anti-migrant they're racist and they'd lose it. Like, they just say, oh, it's just necessary.
It's necessary we have these walls and detention centres, and it's necessary that private companies administer the walls and detention centres because the market knows best.
Like, even if it wasn't racist, making profits by brutalising and dehumanising vulnerable people is still something to be ashamed of.
Yeah, it is absolutely racism that allows people to value those lives less. Do you know what I mean? So it's that, that it's and I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to kind of talk about profit making and kind of move the conversation a little bit away from this kind of idea about moral obligation and legal obligation, because then we get caught up in this idea of like there being kind of good guys and bad guys and good humanitarians and that kind of thing. Even those humanitarian arguments often come back to this claim of pragmatism. And so this comes up a lot in the book, is kind of humanitarian aid organizations can kind of extend or echo these same kind of arguments that the state makes. So you have NGOs that are kind of saying, well, we only want to help deserving asylum seekers. We want to support victims. If someone doesn't look like they've got a good case, then maybe they're not the kind of person that we want to support, right?
Yeah.
And
Bad PR.
Right, exactly. Or there's a chapter in the book that talks about this kind of relationship between the Red Cross and the Danish state, and how people within the Red Cross are often kind of doing the work of the state in terms of restricting asylum seekers' access to how many apples they're allowed to eat and that kind of thing, but also managing asylum seekers in these detention centres or de facto detention centres, but seeing themselves as doing good work and kind of preventing the punitive state from hurting people. Like, I've kind of put myself in the way, but not really recognising that they need to fulfill the state's requests, otherwise their funding will stop. Ultimately, they as individuals are going to benefit because that looks good on your resume, on your CV. How many years experience have I got at Red Cross before I can move on to the UNHCR or move elsewhere? So you get this kind of humanitarian professional who, and I think this is an argument that we make throughout the book that is maybe the most challenging for people, because a lot of people, I think, who would want to read the book maybe are involved in organisations that are providing aid, and we're not at all saying that is a bad thing at all, but we are encouraging kind of a critical reflection on the ways in which aid organisations and the staff and volunteers of aid organisations might benefit from social capital, if not financial capital, through their work. It's a bit of a challenging argument, I think. And we're certainly not putting them on a par with the arms manufacturers that are lobbying the EU to buy biometric passport systems from them. That's a very different class.
Yeah, like, we've got to reflect on this kind of stuff critically, because you have to be critical yourself to improve. And I don't think you should worry like it's coming across bad, because it's so clear you're reflective about yourself as well. You're critical of like literally yourself in here. Like, there's that bit. I might just read it out. Actually, So Siobhán closes her section, which we'll get into in a sec, with dropping this nuke. It is reassuring to think that I am a different sort of anthropologist, a different sort of NGO volunteer, a different sort of writer, or that my words jam the gears of rhetorical juggernauts, promoting and justifying colonial, racist, xenophobic, elitist, homonormative, neoliberal norms. But I also recognise I've been complicit in every act. And it's like, fuck. But because you say it's critical self-reflection. You're not just railing at these things blindly. It's constructive, and you're pointing out major problems. Like you say, doing messed up, deeply problematic stuff because it's going to look okay on your CV.
Yeah.
But it's self-reflective as well.
Absolutely, and it's important that we're real about that. I mean, when the book is on my CV, I mention it in a job application. This is my area of expertise. But actually, I'm drawing on ideas that people have shared with me, and conversations that people have opened up to me and invite me into their lives. And those people haven't had the financial capital, the social capital, the citizenship, the white privilege that I've had in order to kind of pursue this area of further study. I mean, this is very real. I mean, when I went to university, it was before the fees were introduced. But even then, going to university was a bit of a privilege. But now, I mean, anthropology, I'm an anthropologist, right? I've got my PhD in anthropology, and I studied anthropology at undergrad. When I went to university, I didn't even know what anthropology was. I found out in an anthropology class, which is wonderful. But I come from a relatively privileged background. I was encouraged to go to university and kind of encouraged to study, and that's great. Now, even if people wanted to, the cost of going into higher education is so prohibitive that a grant of asylum or a kind of opportunity to kind of rebuild your life in a ostensibly more kind of safe environment, how long does it take then to get enough financial capital to go and have the opportunity to be supported in doing this kind of research? So I definitely would say that I'm so grateful for the people who have opened up their worlds and their analysis and offered me incredible insights and trusted me, I suppose, to write about them in these ways. So yeah, definitely this book is for those people. I think we put that in the dedication, the acknowledgements.
Yeah, you can tell it's like threaded through every one of the pieces. That's where people are coming from. Is there anything you might suggest listeners could do that's worthwhile? Critical self-reflection necessary, but is there anything you would recommend? Presumably, community helping things embedded in the communities themselves it seems to be what you're suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing, certainly over the last few months, we've seen incredible community-led and community-based action, mutual aid networks setting up everywhere. And I think I would encourage that and say, I hope in no way anyone is dissuaded or feels powerless by any kind of critical analysis that I might have or that's in the book about volunteer-based organisations. I would say join those organisations. Don't try and make those organisations unless you are kind of situated in them. I mean, founding organisations that are to help others is always an area that I think should demand critical reflection, because the question is like, who asked you to help? And that's kind of the tyranny of good intentions. But good intentions can be channeled in wonderful directions. So I think, look at your local communities and see what kind of organisations are providing direct aid. There's so many around the UK. A lot of them are very locally based, and it might just be providing support to kind of fill that gap where the government has failed. Clothing, goods that people need, financial support that people need. It's very much area by area. So I encourage people to look locally. Yeah. But at the same time, to kind of keep eyes on what the government is doing and oppose it. I mean, I'm not convinced that write to your MP and start a petition are particularly effective tools. I would say they are tools in a toolkit that also includes direct action. There's a chapter in the book by two members of the Stanford 15 who physically prevented a deportation flight from taking off. A huge personal risk, but they're a very important action. And so I think there's a whole spectrum of things that people can do. People should do what they're comfortable with, but definitely keep eyes on government policy. Feel empowered to correct people in your family circles around the virtual Christmas table that when they kind of make these claims about pragmatism, being armed with a few statistics doesn't hurt, or a few kind of gentle questions around why people have those beliefs. Because I think people, if they're pushed a little bit, often kind of fold, and their prejudices can be exposed for what they are, rather than kind of cloaked in pragmatism.
If you're not going to de-radicalise your granddad, who is?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Siobhán, and best of luck with the book. It's really good, and I think Mando's listeners will be interested to read it.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about it. It's co-edited by my colleague Adrian Pine, and I have to thank all the contributors because, as I said, it's an edited volume. It's not only my ideas, and the book is available at Waterstones, WH Smith's, all those local places, and even your local independent bookstore. And I encourage you to support your local independent bookstore.
A lot of them are doing mail order stuff.
Yeah, don't buy it from Amazon. It is available on Amazon, but don't get it on Amazon.
Jeff does not need the money, people.
Do not get it on Amazon. Amazon provides technical support to immigration and customs enforcement in the US. Do not get it from Amazon. Get it from your local independent bookstore.
Mandatory Redistribution Party was created and produced by Sean Morley and Jack Evans. Our title theme was created by Ella Jean. Thanks so much to our guest, Siobhán McGuirk. Honestly, check out the book Asylum for sale, but obviously defo, don't get it off Amazon, because we'll find out and get honking mad. As always, thank you very much for listening, chucking us a review on iTunes, subscribing to Patreon, or sharing our episodes on social media. We love it. Bye.